Good afternoon, everybody. Hope everybody is having a safe day right now. Hopefully, y'all are enjoying the time with your family, recognizing that this is a unique period in our history. I wish y'all all the best. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that Professor Moore had us do. She had us pick what we consider a social problem, and then we have to kind of go through and develop it and kind of present why we think it's a social problem. I am doing addiction in the United States. Of course, this is one of the issues that hit close to home. I am going to do a little bit of house cleaning before we start. If it's something that's kind of personal or something that I developed, there will not be a citation. However, if it's information I gleaned from another source, the citation will be located at the bottom of the screen. And I also want to just a little bit more house cleaning. I'm on a new medicine. It's causing quite a bit of dry mouth. So you will see me take some drinks during this talk. And so, once again, Robert Bell, Sociology 1306, Social Problems, Professor Moore. So, the first thing we of course, we got to ask, is addiction in the United States a sociological issue? In order to be classified as a sociological issue, it has to meet two specific criteria. The first one being the objective elements, and the objective element is awareness of a social condition through one's own life experiences and through reports in the media. And I'm going to start off. Most of y'all know that I'm pretty open about my struggle with alcoholism and addiction. So I just kind of want to start off with my own life experiences. What you see in front of you right now is a picture of me, West Texas High School class of 95. This picture was before I'd ever taken a drink, smoked a cigarette, even dipped. So at this point in time, my life was pretty stable, and it was going pretty good. Of course, I have been diagnosed also with bipolar disorder and potentially borderline personality disorder. I believe it wasn't noticeable in high school because I was just so active. This picture is a picture of me and two of my friends at a bar. This picture was taken when I was around 21, and by this time I was a full blown alcoholic. However, of course, being 21, 22, you kind of just think you're drinking like kids your age drink. So I didn't recognize that I had a problem with alcohol. Moving on, of course, I shifted my addiction from alcohol to methamphetamines. This picture is a picture of me that was taken in May of 2009. I went to treatment for the first time August of 2009. I was there about a week, and I actually convinced myself and my family that I actually wasn't an addict. I just needed to get my mental issues taken care of. And then once that was done, the addiction should just slip away. So I was in treatment that first time for about a week, came home. I did start seeing, I saw a psychiatrist once or twice. I saw a therapist once or twice, but I never actually followed through. You can clearly tell what the damage of crystal meth has done to my body. I was at this point probably about 150 pounds. And unfortunately, because of the aspect of the mental illness, I actually consider this as me being highly attractive. This picture is taken, and of course, it is a mugshot taken in 2018. I did have a relapse in July of 2018 actually. But I am very proud to say that I have been sober since that July 26th, 2018 relapse. Of course, when we talk about one's own social awareness, or one's person's experience, I have experienced a lot of my friends overdosing. This next slide, you'll see a picture on the left of Nick. Nick was about 34 years old. Before his addiction took control, he was an attorney in Boston. He left behind, I think, 3 kids and a wife. Chase on the left, this is an earlier picture, but he overdosed and died when he was about 22. He did leave behind a son. And these are probably two of the most important people that were in my life. My best friends, Bill Peets and Carrie Eldridge. Bill overdosed probably around October of 2018. Carrie was a little bit earlier, probably June of 2016. Um, just to let you know, Carrie also left behind three kids. Now we want to talk about kind of like, because the objective element also includes media. I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of people. The first one being Rob Lowe. I picked him because not only is he a famous actor, but he also transitioned from a teen into an adult actor. He says he was addicted to sex, alcohol, and drugs. And you can kind of see that because in the late 80s, I believe, he had a huge scandal because he was having sex with women. He was recording it without their permission, and that was fueled by alcohol. Next person I want to talk about is Alec Baldwin. Of course, once again, a famous actor. In his younger days, had a couple of drinking and driving incidences. I don't know if they actually gave him DUIs, but I do know that he has that issue. He maintains 30 years of sobriety. That is through the help of Alcoholics Anonymous. We will talk about that in just a second. And the last person I want to talk about that has been reported in the media is somebody that most people don't really know, Betty Ford. She is one of our former first ladies. She was addicted to alcohol and prescription pills. She had a lot of courage talking about her battle. And she also co founded a nonprofit called the Betty Ford Center, which is a treatment center for alcohol and addiction. Of course, lots of people have been in this center, famous and not famous. Talked a lot about how difficult it was for women to get sober. Now we're going to move on to what are the subjective elements. And give me just a second, sorry. The subjective elements are the belief that a particular social condition is harmful to society or to a segment of society, and that it should and can be changed. And one of the first groups of people that recognize that addiction, and I will include alcoholism because it is the same, it's an addiction to a substance. They were one of the first groups of people that recognized the problem. It was founded around 1935. There was a little bit of controversy. I actually am a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. But it's also very important to recognize that after AA was started, there have been many groups that have spun off of AA. You have NA that was founded in the 70s. You also have Crystal Meth Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous, uh, Smoke Pot Smokers Anonymous, Crack Smokers Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous, Sex and Love and Addicts Anonymous, Sex Addicts Anonymous. So you can see how this one group kind of spurred rapid growth into other 12-step programs. I want to talk a little bit about MAD. MAD stands for Mothers Against Drunk Driving. That was founded in May of 1980. And then the last group I kind of want to talk about is the Partnership for a Drug-Free America. It was formed in 1985, and it had a huge presence on television and through advertisement. And I kind of just want to take a brief minute and show you one of their advertisements. Sorry. I do apologize. It was working earlier. I do not know. Okay, there we go.
Only one drug is so addictive, 9 out of 10 laboratory rats will use it. And use it. And use it. Until dead. It's called cocaine, and it can do the same thing to you.
Alrighty. So we've kind of talked a little bit about some of the groups that have names, but I also want to talk about the population of the United States. During the 60s and 70s, there was rising popularity of cocaine. And in addition to cocaine, there was also crack. Crack is a form of cocaine, but the increased amount of popularity led to a renewed demand from our public that something should be done about American drug abuse. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is like, what is addiction? In order to kind of qualify it as a social problem, we need to have a definition. Our first definition comes from the Encyclopedia Britannica. Drug abuse, I kind of classify in the same realm of addiction, and it is defined as the excessive, maladaptive, or addictive use of drugs for non medical purposes, despite psychological and physical problems that may arise from such use. I also want to give y'all the definition that comes from the DSM-5. And the thing with addiction is there's kind of like the main diagnosis. However, based upon that main diagnosis, there are a trickle of other diagnoses that can coincide with this definition or with this diagnosis. And it just says basically substance use disorder is a cluster of cognitive, behavioral, and psychological symptoms indicating that the individual continues using the substance despite significant substance related problems. An important characteristic of substance use disorder is an underlying change in the brain circuits that may persist beyond detoxification, particularly in individuals with severe disorders. And I kind of just wanted to talk a little bit about my being diagnosed with this. Um, like I said, I had some mental problems that went undiagnosed. And then in 2006, I did see a psychiatrist. However, he diagnosed me as just having depression, uh, which is understandable because basically you're self reporting the symptoms that you see. It wasn't until 2010 when I actually received my diagnosis of bipolar disorder. And the thing with bipolar disorder is a lot of people um, use alcohol or drugs that are illegal to kind of manage their symptoms. Um, so it was hard once I got that diagnosis to maintain the medication regimen. Just another quick statistic, according to the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, 19.7 million American adults, of course, age 12 or older, battled substance use disorder in 2017. Now, I think it's kind of important to recognize that this is a survey. And as we've talked about, surveys are not 100% reliable. Um, a lot of people are or have shame around it. So if they're asked about it, they're not going to be truthful. So that statistic could actually be higher. I want to talk a little bit about overdose rates. This first slide is about overdose rates involving opioids. Of course, heroin is in the categories of opioids. The very top line that you're going to see, and I wish I could show it differently, but is actually just combined any opioid. And of course, you can see around 2012, 2013, a dramatic increase. The next line is commonly prescribed opioids. A lot of people have this idea that if it's prescribed to them, then they're not addicted to it. However, becoming addicted to prescribed medications, and then if you abuse them, you can overdose and die. The very next line, which is a little bit lighter, is other synthetic opioids. That's going to include like fentanyl, those kind of things. And once again, you can see 2013, a huge increase. And that very last line is heroin. You can see that it maintains pretty steady up until about 2010. That's when the rise in heroin overdoses started to occur. I'm going to talk a little bit about alcoholism. Every day, 20 people in the United States die due to motor vehicle crashes that are involved with alcohol. This is one death every 50 minutes. And just to kind of put a number or a dollar sign around that, the cost of alcohol related crashes actually totals more than 44 billion. Now I want to talk about cocaine. So cocaine involved overdose death rates in the United States. Actually, there was a decrease between 2006 and 2012, but in 2012 it began to increase again. In 2017, the overdose deaths involving cocaine increased by more than 34%. That's a dramatic increase in 1 year alone. And the number is 14,000 Americans died from an overdose involving cocaine from 2016 to 2017. Just going to kind of talk about a dollar sign in general that involves everything. Abuse of tobacco, alcohol, and illicit drugs. It's extremely costly. You see, it exacts more than 740 billion annually in costs related to crime, lost work, productivity, and healthcare. And what you'll see a little bit on down the road is the costs in the judicial system. So now I'm going to give you just a little bit of timeline of some important people that have done research, and we consider them leaders in the field of addiction. I didn't pick a whole lot because I recognize that there is a lot of information that I'm giving you all. The first one was kind of shocking to me. Dr. Benjamin Rush, he founded the very first medical school in the U.S., and he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, was one of the pioneers of U.S. drug abuse research. Then we go to Dr. Leslie Keeley. Listed him just mainly because he had a big spectrum of institutions. He had 120 that were located all across North America and in Europe. These consisted of an addiction cure institute, a little bit of mental health services, proprietary home cures, such as the bottled double chloride of gold that was supposedly a cure for alcoholism. However, what we kind of recognize now is that some of what he did was not based upon science. Then we're going to move on to Dr. Herbert Levinstein. He was one of the first people that identified key elements in opioid addiction that would spur further research. He had the fixation on the drugs that made it the highest priority, even when the user's life situation was deteriorating. He was curious about the phenomenon of withdrawal and how that could be reversed quickly by giving more opioids. I'm going to expand upon this a little bit. Of course, the people I showed you at the beginning of this presentation, they overdosed. However, they never talked about their withdrawal with me. But I do want to go back a little bit to one of my first times in treatment. One of my best friends, she was a heroin addict, and she wasn't given the opportunity to medically detox. And that's something that is very important, especially with heroin and alcoholism. And I watched her for a month being in such dramatic pain, always throwing up. She felt like she had the flu. So the withdrawal for opioids is pretty severe. Now, the withdrawal from uppers is what we call them, cocaine, methamphetamines, on those things. You really don't have to detox. Like for me, they put me in when I went to Palm Partners in 2016. They put me in detox, but I didn't require any medications, and I was there for about a day and a half. So you can kind of tell the difference. Dr. Bruce Alexander, he is world known, or he's known worldwide because of a study he did in 1971 called Rat Park. I'm not going to talk very much about Rat Park because we're going to watch a video at the end that kind of goes into detail. And this name, I apologize, but I'm going to butcher it. It's Dr. Gallo. The reason why he is included is because he was on the board that kind of changed some laws. Portugal, up until 2001, led Western Europe in the amount of overdoses, the amount of new HIV cases. When they did surveys, people self reported more experimentation than any other country. So Portugal decided, and I'm not going to go too much into this because the video also will. They got a board together full of scientists and doctors, and basically they completely changed how they handled illegal drug use and alcoholism. But like I said, that will go into detail further on down the road. Dr. Peter Cohen, he's included because he has done studies on how human connection to others can have a drastic effect on addiction. And Dr. Marco Venero, and I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, he is a CCB fellow at the National Institute of Drug Abuse. He actually has done studies that have gone into detail in regards to relapse. So now that we've talked a little bit about the qualifications for alcoholism and addiction to be considered a social problem, we've looked at the figures, the overdose rates, the cost to the American people, and we've looked at some famous people. We're going to move on to how the United States responded to the addiction problem. And give me just a second. I apologize. One of the first things that the United States did is they passed what they call the Opioid Exclusion Act. It basically banned the importation of opium for the use of smoking. However, it did not ban the importation of opiums for other reasons. So people still used it. Of course, there were those that I'm for sure still smoked it, but it was still available for public use. Then we move on a few years, and the federal government passes the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914, among a lot of other things that required importers, manufacturers, and distributors of cocaine and opiums to register with the U.S. Then we're going to move on to the Marijuana Taxation Act of 1937. Just a little background: until 1937, the growth and use of marijuana was legal under a federal law. But during the course of promoting federal legislation to control marijuana, Henry Anslinger, who was the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and others submitted testimony to Congress. And basically, they stated the evils of marijuana use, and they claimed that it incited violent and insane behavior. Then we're going to move on to the Boggs Act of 1951. It actually established mandatory prison sentences for some drug offenses. And I think it's important to recognize at this point that because of how our Constitution is set up, we have the federal guidelines, but also states can do their own thing. A lot of times, however, the federal will override the state. In 1956, the Narcotic Control Act, which you'll see later on is the NCA, further increased penalties for drug offenses, and it actually established the death penalty for people that were selling heroin to the youth. Then we had the Controlled Substances Act. It was enacted as Title II of a Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970. It placed the control of select plants, drugs, and chemical substances under federal jurisdiction. And Congress passed this legislation in part to replace a lot of the previous federal laws with one single statute. Once again, I apologize. And in 1973, President Nixon authorized the creation of a single mission federal agency. We know that today as the DEA. And then later on, the DEA was incorporated or enveloped into the Department of Justice. Now, at this time, we have Ronald Reagan as president, and his administration pushed for the legislation called the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984. What that did is it enhanced penalties for the Controlled Substance Act violations, and it amended that to establish general criminal forfeiture provisions for certain felony drug violations. All that means is basically if you're convicted, they can take away your property or that kind of thing. Now I want to kind of look at the result of the federal response to the drug abuse problem in the United States. Um, the first thing is every 25 seconds, someone in America is arrested for drug possession. The number of Americans arrested for possession actually has tripled since 1980, and it is about 1.3 million arrests per year in 2015. That is 6 times the number of arrests for drug sales. So the arrest of people that are actually the users, it really drastically is different than the people that are arrested for actually providing the substances to get these people high or drunk. This is just a couple charts. It starts off in 1982. The first chart is drug abuse violation arrest from 1982 to 2007. Of course, you can see the increase uh, that more than doubles the amount of that were being arrested in 1982. The next chart you see is arrest by type of drug. Once again, you see the sales and manufacturing is relatively low, and it's kind of maintained just a steady line. However, if you look at the possession arrest, you'll notice that that has gone up dramatically since 1982. And then this last chart, I wanted to include drug arrest by age. I think it's important to recognize that the juvenile arrest, that line is pretty steady as well. However, once again, we look at the adults, and what we see is there was a pretty big increase until about 1990, decreased a little bit, and then it started climbing again until it reached the peak at the end of this study in 2007 of over more than 1,500,000 people being arrested. Since 1971, the war on drugs has cost the United States basically about $1 trillion. In 2015, the federal government, and once again, keep in mind the states do some things and the federal government does others. The federal government in 2015 spent 9.2 million every day to incarcerate people who were charged with drug-related offenses. That actually equates to more than $3.3 billion annually. Going to talk a little bit about the prison population. There is a strong connection between being an inmate and drug related offenses. Once again, like I said, you saw earlier the amount of drug users that were being arrested. So while the exact rates of inmates that have that substance use disorder, it's difficult to measure. Some research shows that about 65% of the prison population actually has an active substance use disorder. And even though there were people that didn't actually qualify under the official DSM criteria, about another 20% were actually arrested. And when they're arrested, they were actually drunk or high at the time of their arrest. The last little piece of information about the response, and this is kind of one of the key things that in sociology we look at, is we kind of look at the differences between different cultures and different ethnicities. And it is important to recognize that Black Americans are 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana charges than white peers. And actually, they make up 30% of all drug related arrests. And that's a pretty high number considering that we have the spectrum of ethnicities. And that is it's disproportionate to the amount, the 12.5% of people or Black African Americans that actually use those substances. Now we're going to talk about how the United States tried to develop some alternative strategies. And the first thing we're going to talk about is in 1935, the Addiction Research Center, created basically in Lexington, Kentucky. The nickname for it is called the Narcotics Farm, and its mission was to develop and implement treatments for people that were addicted. It was affiliated with the federal prison in Lexington, so a vast majority of the people that were in the narcotics farm were inmates. However, they did actually allow people that wanted to voluntarily admit themselves. They were allowed to enter the narcotics farm. In 1963, Congress also began to support the medical approach addressing drug abuse. And basically, there was a report that came out that stated that some people could get better. And so they and called the Narcotic Addict Rehabilitation Act. It was legislation that was passed, and it declared its support for rehabilitation through treatment, like I said earlier. The Narcotics Rehabilitation Act, which was mentioned in the last slide, it is the policy of Congress that certain persons charged with or convicted of violating federal criminal laws who are determined to be addicted to narcotics, that they are likely to be rehabilitated through treatment, and in lieu of prosecution and sentencing, should be civilly committed for confinement and treatment designed to effect their restoration to health and a return to society as useful members. So, of course, clearly at this point in time, we have kind of like a mixed message because we have the laws and the incarceration is increasing. However, the federal government is trying to decrease the amount of people in the federal prisons. Now, once again, we need to keep in mind that there's the federal stuff and the state stuff. So even if somebody on the federal level was decided that charges shouldn't be brought against them, the state actually could. The federal government and the states have also enacted what are called drug courts and also veterans treatment centers. And basically, how that works is instead of being part of the criminal justice system, you're put in this what they call drug courts and veteran treatment courts. They're going to actually set up some guidelines and some requirements that you need to meet. If you meet all those things, then you have to go back repeatedly at the end of your time. Basically, there's nothing that goes on your record. Of course, it is important to talk about once a problem is established as a social problem, how the three main theories would look at that social problem. And we're going to start off with the structuralist and the functionalist perspective. Sorry, that's one group. And if you remember back in Sociology 1, that the functionalists believed that every person was assigned a role, and if those roles changed quickly, society as a whole falls apart. So the functionalist perspective of drug abuse is basically it's weakening societal norms, and then as society becomes more complex and as rapid social change occurs, the norms and values become unclear and also ambiguous, and it results in anomie. And remember, that means basically, what are we to do? We don't know. And of course, those strains on society lead to drug abuse. The conflict perspective basically states that drug use occurs as a response to the inequality perpetuated by the capitalist system, which is, of course, the people that own the means to everything, and the workers. So basically, it says that inequality is what causes drug abuse. Now, I do want to mention at this point that addiction is what we call the great equalizer in Alcoholics Anonymous. It affects rich people, it affects poor people, it affects young people, old people. So even though the conflict perspective says that the drug use is a response by that, we know that it affects everybody. The symbolic interactionist perspective basically states that if the first time you use it's pleasurable, you're more than likely to do it again. And then if you continually do it, you may be given the label of a drug user. And then if you actually internalize that label and assume the identity, the behavior continues and it probably escalates. And my experience with this was that the first time I drank, I enjoyed it. The first time I used, I enjoyed it. I continued to do it up until the point where it had control of my life instead of me having control of my life. The thing to remember as far as specifically drugs is certain drugs you may start off using in groups, but my experience shows that eventually you end up using alone. So that kind of may be a little contradictory to what the symbolic interactionist would view. Now, the last thing I want to do is I kind of wanted to be creative and I wanted to develop a plan. And you'll hear a little bit about my plan in the last video that we're going to watch. However, I expanded it quite a bit. And I'm going to get a drink. Sorry. So the first thing I would do is I would actually decriminalize possession of everything, except when the quantities would be considered amount enough to sell it, and also for manufacturing, those kind of things. And so clearly decriminalize it for the users, which helps our prison population. I would move all the charges for manufacturing and distribution to the federal level for prosecution, just simply because we want to try to get as much away from the states, more to the federal level in regards to that. And the federal level actually has more resources available for research, the judicial system, that kind of thing. So if we're moving people away from the criminal justice system, we're going to try to shift them into the mental health system. So the money that would be used for incarceration of a person who was just caught with simple possession, we would shift all those funds to the mental health system. And in doing that, we're giving people the help that they need. And there's a lot of people that are dual diagnosed. I've read different and conflicting reports, but the majority of what I read say that about 70% of people with a mental illness also struggle with addiction. So that shift in funding would help. Another thing I would do is I would utilize oil and tax revenue to provide either free tuition or a reduced tuition for those that want to achieve a bachelor's degree in mental health profession, such as therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists, licensed chemical dependency counselors. So just giving them the funding so that we can increase the number of providers, because we're going to need that increase because we're no longer criminalizing um, substance use. We're now treating it as a mental health issue once again. I would also, we're going to need to have some way to supervise to make sure people are following up. So, of course, we're going to utilize the probation officers, kind of to ensure therapeutic and the psychiatric services, just making sure people are compliant. On the federal level, we would offer microloans to small businesses who are willing to hire people participating in mental health services for their addiction. That's going to do a couple of things. Once again, you have the people that need the help getting the help. However, you're offering small businesses loans, or you could even give them grants so that they can hire people with the hopes of expanding their business. And I apologize, I meant to put that on the slide. We also would work with various 12-step programs because there are people that want to participate, and that adds just an extra layer to success. One of the things that I do recognize is that in certain periods or places, there is a strong connection to addiction and a lack of mental health providers. The Texas Panhandle is one of them. So I would look at the areas that are hardest hit by addiction, and I would offer things such as rent reimbursement for providers who are willing to contract for extended periods of time. So once again, we've got the tuition being taken care of, and then we would help them with living expenses, and that would attract a lot more people, and it would give us the amount of providers needed instead of the shortage that we currently have. I would work with private health insurers to expand coverage and reduce out of pocket expenses. Um, if you're not aware, if you have private insurance, a lot of them offer limited mental health services. However, like for me, I have a $700 deductible for like physical health, like for my feet problems, I have back problems, but I also have a $700 deductible for mental health services. And then I still have the copays for both. So one thing like I would do is I would get rid of the deductible for mental health services and lower copays for those that have health insurance. Now, one thing that is important is right now, of course, our country is in a struggle. We're trying to decide if we want a single payer health system, and that would insure everybody. I would also use programs like HOPWA. That HOPWA stands for Housing Opportunities for People with AIDS. Um, One of the problems with addiction is a lot of people end up homeless. HOPWA, as a part of the program for HIV and AIDS, they recognize that when people have safe housing, they're more likely to stay med compliant. So I believe if we use a program like that as a blueprint, then we could ensure that people have housing and that their mental health needs are being provided for. Of course, once again, we're offering those micro loans, or we could change it to grants so that small businesses would be more willing to hire people that are actually participating in their treatment program, and that helps them expand businesses. And then, of course, we've taken the need for building bigger prisons away from the state, and then we've added a little bit of extra work to the federal government. However, the federal government has their own guidelines. And the very last thing I would do is I would just blitz the TV with advertisements. Right now, of course, there's a lot of stigma and shame around mental health. So I would direct advertisement to just combat that, bring down that reduction so that reduce that shame that people feel. And that would hopefully increase the willingness of people to seek out services such as treatment, mental health, therapy, that kind of thing. So that, of course, is my plan. And the last thing I want to do is I want to show you a video that I saw about 2 or 3 years ago that really hit home. Little bit of things that I want to talk about that he's going to discuss that I think may be a little bit different is there are some researchers that have shown that some people have the genetic makeup to become alcoholics. So he's going to kind of say a little bit about the connection with people, but I want to also mention that research has shown that a limited portion of the population has the DNA to become an alcoholic.
One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And I was just a little kid, so I didn't really understand why. But as I got older, I realized we had drug addiction in my family, including later cocaine addiction. I've been thinking about it a lot lately, partly because it's now exactly 100 years since drugs were first banned in the United States and Britain, and we then imposed that on the rest of the world. It's a century since we made this really fateful decision to take addicts and punish them and make them suffer because we believed that would deter them, it would give them an incentive to stop. And a few years ago, I was looking at some of the addicts in my life who I love and trying to figure out if there was some way to help them. And I realized there were loads of incredibly basic questions I just didn't know the answer to. Like, what really causes addiction? Why do we carry on with this approach that doesn't seem to be working? And is there a better way out there that we could try instead? So I read loads of stuff about it, and I couldn't really find the answers I was looking for. So I thought, okay, I'll go and sit with different people around the world who've lived this and studied this and talk to them and see if I can learn from them. And I didn't realize I would end up going over 30,000 miles at the start, but I ended up going and meeting loads of different people, from a transgender crack dealer in Brownsville, Brooklyn, to a scientist who spends a lot of time feeding hallucinogens to mongooses to see if they like them. It turns out they do, but only in very specific circumstances. To the only country that's ever decriminalized all drugs, from cannabis to crack, Portugal. And the thing I realized that really blew my mind is almost everything we think we know about addiction is wrong. And if we start to absorb the new evidence about addiction, I think we're going to have to change a lot more than our drug policies. But let's start with what we think we know, what I thought I know, right? Let's think about this middle row here, right? Imagine all of you for 20 days now went off and used heroin 3 times a day. Some of you look a little bit more enthusiastic than others at this prospect. Don't worry, it's just a thought experiment. Imagine you did that, right? What would happen? Now, we have a story about what would happen that we've been told for a century. We think because there are chemical hooks in heroin, as you took it for a while, your body would become dependent on those hooks, you'd start to physically need them, and at the end of those 20 days, you'd all be heroin addicts, right? That's what I thought. First thing that alerted me to the fact something not right with this story is when it was explained to me, if I step out of this TED Talk today and I get hit by a car and I break my hip, I'll be taken to hospital and I'll be given loads of diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin. It's actually much better heroin than you're ever going to buy on the streets because the stuff you buy from a drug dealer is contaminated, actually very little of it is heroin, whereas the stuff you get from the doctor is medically pure. And you'll be given it for quite a long period of time. There are loads of people in this room who may not realize that you've taken quite a lot of heroin, right? And anyone watching this anywhere in the world, this is happening. And if what we believe about addiction is right, those people are exposed to all those chemical hooks. What should happen? They should become addicts. This has been studied really carefully. It doesn't happen. You will have noticed if your grandmother had a hip replacement, she didn't come out as a junkie. And when I learned this, it just seemed so weird to me, so contrary to everything I'd been told, everything I thought I knew. I just thought it couldn't be right. Until I went and met a man called Bruce Alexander, who's a professor of psychology in Vancouver, who carried out an incredible experiment that I think really helps us to understand this issue. Professor Alexander explained to me, the idea of addiction we've all got in our heads, that story, comes partly from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. You can do them tonight when you go home if you feel a little bit sadistic. You get a rat and you put it in a cage, and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself quite quickly. So there you go, right? That's how we think it works. In the 70s, Professor Alexander comes along and he looks at this experiment and he noticed something. He said, we're putting the rat in an empty cage. It's got nothing to do except use these drugs. Let's try something a bit different. So Professor Alexander built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically heaven for rats, right? They've got loads of cheese, they've got loads of coloured balls, they've got loads of tunnels. Crucially, they've got loads of friends, they can have loads of sex, and they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drugged water. But here's the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water. They almost never use it. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. You go from almost 100% overdose when they're isolated to 0% overdose when they have happy and connected lives. Now, when he first saw this, Professor Alexander thought, maybe this is just a thing about rats. They're quite different to us, maybe not as different as we'd like, but, But fortunately, there was a human experiment into the exact same principle happening at the exact same time. It was called the Vietnam War. In Vietnam, 20% of all American troops were using loads of heroin. And if you look at the news reports from the time, they were really worried because they thought, my God, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of junkies on the streets of the United States when the war ends. It made total sense. Now, those soldiers who were using loads of heroin were followed home. The Archives of General Psychiatry did a really detailed study, and what happened to them? It turns out they didn't go to rehab. They didn't go into withdrawal. 95% of them just stopped. Now, if you believe the story about chemical hooks, that makes absolutely no sense. But Professor Alexander began to think there might be a different story about addiction. He said, what if addiction isn't about your chemical hooks? What if addiction is about your cage? What if addiction is an adaptation to your environment? Looking at this, there was another professor called Peter Cohen in the Netherlands who said, maybe we shouldn't even call it addiction. Maybe we should call it bonding. Human beings have a natural and innate need to bond. And when we're happy and healthy, we'll bond and connect with each other. But if you can't do that because you're traumatized or isolated or beaten down by life, you will bond with something that will give you some sense of relief. Now, that might be gambling, that might be pornography, that might be cocaine, that might be cannabis. But you will bond and connect with something because that's our nature. That's what we want as human beings. And I think, at first I found this quite a difficult thing to get my head around, but one way that helped me to think about it is, and I can see, I've got over by my seat there a bottle of water, right? I'm looking at lots of you, and lots of you have bottles of water with you, right? Forget drugs, forget the drug war. Totally legally, all of those bottles of water could be bottles of vodka, right? We could all be getting drunk, I might after this. But we're not, right? Now, because you've been able to afford the approximately a gazillion pounds that it costs to get into a TED Talk, I'm guessing you guys could afford to be drinking vodka for the next 6 months. You wouldn't end up homeless. You're not going to do that. And the reason you're not going to do that is not because anyone's stopping you. It's because you've got bonds and connections that you want to be present for. You've got work you love. You've got people you love. You've got healthy relationships. And a core part of addiction, I came to think, and I believe the evidence suggests, is about not being able to bear to be present in your life. Now, this has really significant implications. The most obvious implications are for the war on drugs, right? In Arizona, I went out with a group of women who were made to wear T-shirts saying I was a drug addict and go out on chain gangs and dig graves while members of the public would jeer at them. And when those women get out of prison, they're going to have criminal records that mean they'll never work in the legal economy again. Now, that's a very extreme example, obviously, in the case of the chain gang, but actually almost everywhere in the world we treat addicts to some degree like that. We punish them, we shame them, we give them criminal records, we put barriers between them reconnecting. There was a doctor in Canada, Dr. Gabor Mate, an amazing man, who said to me, if you wanted to design a system that would make addiction worse, you would design that system. Now, there's a place that decided to do the exact opposite, and I went there to see how it worked. In the year 2000, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in Europe. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is kind of mind-blowing. And every year, they tried the American way more and more. They punished people and stigmatized them and shamed them more. And every year, the problem got worse. And one day, the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together and basically said, look, we can't go on with a country where we're having ever more people becoming heroin addicts. Let's set up a panel of scientists and doctors to figure out what would genuinely solve the problem. And they set up a panel led by an amazing man called Dr. Juan Goulart to look at all this new evidence. And they came back and they said, decriminalize all drugs, from cannabis to crack. But, and this is the crucial next step, take all the money we used to spend on cutting addicts off, on disconnecting them, and spend it instead on reconnecting them with the society. And that's not, essentially, that's not really what we think of. What they did wasn't really what we think of as drug treatment in the United States and Britain. So they do residential rehab, they do psychological therapy that does have some value. But the biggest thing they did was the complete opposite of what we do. A massive program of job creation for addicts and microloans for addicts to set up small businesses. So say you used to be a mechanic. When you're ready, they go to a garage and they'll say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. The goal was to make sure that every addict in Portugal had something to get out of bed for in the morning. And when I went and met the addicts in Portugal, it was fascinating. What they said is, as they rediscovered purpose, they rediscovered bonds and relationships with the wider society. It'll be 15 years this year since that experiment began, and the results are in. Injecting drug use is down in Portugal, according to the British Journal of Criminology, by 50%, 50%. Overdose is massively down, HIV is massively down among addicts, addiction in every study is significantly down. One of the ways you know it's worked so well is that almost nobody in Portugal wants to go back to the old system. Now, that's the kind of political implications. I actually think there's a layer of implications to all this research below that. You know, we live in a culture where people feel really increasingly vulnerable to all sorts of addictions, whether it's to their smartphones or to shopping or to eating. You know, before these talks began, you guys know this, that we were told we weren't allowed to have our smartphones on. And I have to say, a lot of you looked an awful lot like addicts who were being told their dealer was going to be unavailable for the next couple of hours. And, you know, a lot of us feel like that. And it might sound weird to say, oh, you know, I've been talking about how disconnection is a major driver of addiction. But weird to say it's growing because you think, well, we're the most connected society there's ever been, surely. But I increasingly began to think that the connection we have, the connections we have, we think we have, are like a kind of parody of human connection. If you have a crisis in your life, you'll notice something. It won't be your Twitter followers who come to sit with you. It won't be your Facebook friends who help you turn it round. It'll be your flesh and blood friends who you have deep and nuanced and textured face-to-face relationships with. And I think there's a study I read about from Bill McKibben, the environmental writer, I think tells us a lot about this. It looked at the number of close friends the average American believes they can call on in a crisis. That number has been declining steadily since the 1950s. The amount of floor space an individual has in their home has been steadily increasing. And I think that's like a metaphor for the choice we've made as a culture. traded floor space for friends. We've traded stuff for connections. And the result is that we are one of the loneliest societies there has ever been. And Bruce Alexander, the guy who did the Rat Park experiment, says, we talk all the time in addiction about individual recovery. And it's right to talk about that. But we need to talk much more about social recovery. Something's gone wrong with us, not just as individuals, but as a group. And we've created a society where, for a lot of us, life looks a whole lot more like that isolated cage and a whole lot less like Rat Park. But if I'm honest, this isn't why I went into it, right? I didn't go in to discover the political stuff, the social stuff. I wanted to know how to help the people I love. And when I came back from this long journey and I'd learned all this, I looked at the addicts in my life, and if you're really candid, it's hard loving an addict, and there's going to be lots of people who know in this room you're angry a lot of the time. And I think one of the reasons why this debate is so charged is because it runs through the heart of each of us, right? Everyone has a bit of them that looks at an addict and thinks, I wish someone would just stop you. And the kind of script we're told for how to deal with the addicts in our life is typified by, I think, by the reality show Intervention. If you guys haven't seen it, I think everything in our lives is typified by reality TV, but that's another TED Talk. If you've never seen the show Intervention, it's a really simple premise. Get an addict, all the people in their life gathering together and say, if you don't shape up, confront them with what they're doing, and they say, if you don't shape up, we're going to cut you off, right? So what they do is they take the connection to the addict and they threaten it. They make it contingent on the addict behaving the way they want. And I began to see why that approach doesn't work. And I began to think that almost that's like the importing of the logic of the drug war into our private lives. So I was thinking, well, how can I be Portuguese, right? And what I try to do now, and I can't tell you I do it consistently, and I can't tell you it's easy, is to say to the addicts in my life that I want to deepen the connection with them, to say to them, I love you whether you're using or you're not. I love you whatever state you're in. And if you need me, I'll come and sit with you because I love you and I don't want you to be alone or to feel alone. And I think the core of that message, you're not alone, we love you, has to be at every level of how we respond to addicts, socially, politically, and individually. For 100 years now, we've been singing war songs about addicts. I think all along we should have been singing love songs to them, because the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. Thank you.
All righty. So just to do some little housework, we've looked at the objective elements, subjective elements, which are the requirements for something to be a social problem. We've looked at statistics as regards to how it is a social problem. We've looked at the United States' response to the problem, and we've looked at the results of that response. We've also gone through the three different theories of how the conflict theorists would view addiction, how the functionalists would view addiction, and how the symbolic interactionists would view addiction. I've given you just a brief overview of a plan that I think would be highly successful. And then to end it up, we watched a video about a guy who did a lot of traveling and a lot of research. And we looked at what he discovered. And so, of course, I do want to, like I said at the beginning or before I started, I mentioned that there is evidence of a genetic makeup for addiction. But also, I failed to mention that I do also believe that sometimes those chemical hooks are there, and they make it extremely hard for an addict to stop. So I just want to thank you. I recognize that there was a lot of information here, and I realize that this was kind of a long one. So thank you so much for sitting through and being patient, and I look forward to your responses. Have a great day.